Day 2 of the lori-vallow-Daybell trial. It was just last week we said, and weeks before we said, I don't know, maybe this one's going to be a little more mellow. Maybe it's going to be a little quieter.
Ha!
It is proving to be dynamic, wow, and explosive. I would call today dramatic. What about you, Erica?
Oh, God. I would call it beyond dramatic. And what you're referring to, Andrea, is the moment lori-vallow-Daybell was kicked out of the courtroom by a judge. And, there was a lot of interesting stuff that led up to that. There was a lot of interesting stuff that came after that. But as we call ourselves inside the courtroom, we want to take you inside to that very moment where this all unfolded. So take a listen.
That if the defendant opens the door and tries to advise that she is a good person, a peaceful person, a kind person, a loving person, any of those other types of things, that we believe that would allow us under 405 to then bring in specific acts such as the murder of her children, her husband, and her current husband's wife.
All right.
Which would also be 404B that they withdrew.
No, it'd be 405.
Yeah, they withdrew it, but if you bring up 404 that you...
Then all 404B is in, or do we get a hearing on what 404B can come in? If I open the door, do I get a hearing? We stop trial and I get a hearing on...
Stop. We'll have a very short hearing, okay? If you're going to introduce how you have great character and good character, we're going to have a short hearing on what evidence that they can bring in to rebut that character, which could include being convicted of 4 murders. So
and would you
talk to your advisory counsel during the break. And
you don't need to yell at me either.
Okay?
Yeah, you are, and you do not need to talk to me that way. I'm very courteous.
Take her out.
I'm very courteous to you.
Take her out. No, you have been nothing near courteous to me during the course of these proceedings. Talk with your advisory counsel about the rest of your cross. We're going to resume in 15 minutes.
All rise.
I call that her timeout. The judge said, get out 15 minutes, or you got to, it's a wise rapper once told us to check ourselves before we wreck ourselves. And that is exactly what that judge was telling her, right? Like, get it together.
Yeah.
He was done.
Well,
he was finished.
I'm so done. And, earlier in the day, I think the tone of the day was essentially, no patience for lori-vallow's antics in the courtroom. And this was such a tense moment. And just to see her confront the judge in that way and to be taken out, it was certainly a jaw dropper in the courtroom. And of course, Andrea, we want to set the stage for everyone a little bit. When we, talk about opening the door, they're referring to bringing in her prior convictions. We know she was convicted in Idaho for killing her children, Tylee and JJ, and for her role in the death of her current husband, Chad Daybell's first wife, Tammy. Just a couple months ago in April here in Arizona, she was convicted for conspiring to kill her former husband, Charles Vallow. And now she is on trial, her third in as many years, for conspiring to kill Brandon Boudreaux, her niece's ex-husband. So she's pled not guilty. She's representing herself, which is why she's getting all this interaction with the judge. And it was truly baffling to see this unfold this way.
Well, and to see him say, you almost can see there's a little attitude behind that statement that he made. I mean, because we talked about that in her opening statement, difficult for us to sit and listen to her talk about, I have no malice for anyone. All I do is spread love. And no matter what happens here in this trial, that's what I'm going to continue to do. When we know the history and we know that, as he said, you have multiple murder convictions. And so, and he made that very clear today. And I think said it's difficult not to feel that tension as he says that, pointing out, watch yourself, you are walking down a path that you may not, likely don't want to go down. And this is an admonition he's made for her multiple times. And you just have to wonder, is it going to work this time? Is it going to stick?
I don't know. And what's interesting, Andrea, is that it feels like everyone's, obviously the jury was not in the room for that moment. They're discussing things outside the presence of the jury. But it feels like she's been given this warning time and time again to not go down a certain path that could open the door to all of this. And it feels like she just keeps going up and knocking. And I don't see how that in any world could benefit her case. So it's an interesting tactic by her. But also, we saw from the jump today that the judge was not having it with her nor her advisory counsel. So these are the people that would have been her public defenders had she not, if she was not to be representing herself. And before court even started, again, before the jury came in, we were waiting. Court started later than it should have. Apparently, one of Lori's advisory council members wasn't there when she should have been. She claimed to be printing off some documents or pictures that Lori would theoretically need during the day today. And she apparently sent some message to the court about 10 minutes before things were supposed to start, saying she was still in her office. So the judge came in and said, well, that's wholly unacceptable, and said if they were something along the lines of if they were in federal court, she could, be taken, into custody at this point. So it was really striking to see him come in with like a no nonsense attitude today. Not that he's ever been nonsense, of course, but this was, I think it really set the tone for the day. And then almost immediately after that, and we'll play it for you guys in just a moment, but Andrea, we went right into, the state's concern with some of the things that Lori-Vallow said in her opening statements. What'd you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting just in the sense of, again, we hear it, we wonder if it's going to be on the record. We know it's said, we wonder how it's going to come up. But as we've talked about, I mean, again, she keeps opening the door herself. And so, and because she's not a trained attorney, she is representing herself. Again, we talk about this often, but he is walking that fine line. He doesn't owe her a lot of this explanation, yet the judge seems to, and even the prosecutor, Trina Kay, seems to go out of their way to put on the record kind of what's happening and why they have a concern with it, almost protecting themselves above and beyond what may even be legally necessary, protecting themselves from any claims, which we know the defendant has made multiple claims of being, unfairly targeted here, the judge being biased against her, really, having a personal bias, I believe is what she has alleged multiple times. Again, today, having a motion denied, you will not get a new judge. This is the judge that's going to hear your case. And so I think that it is interesting to hear just how, just how proactive they are in all of these acknowledgement of what she's doing and warnings to stop.
Yeah. And, Andrea, we talk a lot about the jury doesn't know her history. The jury doesn't know her history. And I feel like this is maybe as close as we've come to, kicking that door wide open. It sounds like something the state, can pivot and be prepared to do. Yeah. And, I think everyone, as you said, is just trying to be really careful. But take a listen to what the state had to bring up as soon as they got on the record today.
She spoke about that she was a person who loved all people, that she has no malice towards people. And then she also spoke about Brandon hiring a private investigator. I want to start with the fact that the defendant is appearing to try to bring in 404 character evidence about herself. Rule 404A does not allow the defendant to bring in character evidence to prove action in conformity, which is clearly what she was doing. Assuming she does, then the rules would permit the state to then bring in specific act evidence of this defendant. The defendant is trying to say she is a peaceful person, she has no malice. I believe that will open the door to allow the state to bring in the fact that she is a 4-time convicted murderer. Next, the defendant, in terms of bringing up information about Brandon hiring a PI and trying to make it appear that he has some vendetta against her, we have worked very hard to try to say there is an incident in Chandler. Brandon Boudreaux was very aware of the fact that this defendant and her brother had shot and killed Charles Vallow. And this is why he was very afraid for his life and trying to realize where she was and where Alex was. So if she wants to go into all of that information, then again, I believe she will be opening the door to allow Brandon to then explain why he was in so much fear for his life, why he was hiring a private investigator to locate this defendant and locate Alex Cox. So I just want to make it very clear that should she go into those areas, I will be asking to then bring in the fact that she has been involved in the murder of Charles Vallow, her own children, and her current husband's wife.
All right.
And I believe 405 will permit that, Your Honor.
So I had literally the same thoughts during her opening statement, especially when she started talking about I'm a person with good intent, kindness, peace and love, etc. And I was thinking in my head, wow, she's opening a big door right here. Now it's not witness testimony. The jury has not has been instructed specifically that that's not evidence or testimony. But I think the notice that the state is putting out right now is well taken, because if you elicit testimony through a witness or you testify yourself along those lines, there's several doors that would be opened in that instance. Do you understand that?
I understand what you're saying, Your Honor.
Okay. The schedule.
Also understand that the state also withdrew their 404B, that they had no intention of doing that. So
That doesn't mean you get to say whatever you want.
I'm not saying that.
Okay.
I'm just saying they did give a notice for 404B, and then they did withdraw it. So they didn't have any intention. I didn't have any intention.
The issue is, if you bring in your good character as a reason of why this didn't happen, they're going to be allowed to rebut that type of testimony because you've opened the door to it.
This is a great example of where she just doesn't understand, or she's pretending to not understand, because she's trying to argue that they told me they weren't, they've told the court they're not going to talk about my past. They don't have a reason to, and therefore, why would they ever go back on their word? That's not how this works, as the judge is trying to explain. And I cannot fathom how, again, exasperated I would feel, I think, as the judge and as the prosecutor, as we just continue to go over and over and over the same thing. And I can't tell can't tell her attitude.
Go ahead, Andrea.
Does she seem flippant? Or kind of like,
It's hard because there's so many times in court where she does seem with it, and you can tell she's paying attention to everything that's going on. But some of her responses are, they need further explanation. They're not appropriate, or not maybe, not something that should be brought up in court. As we see, throughout the course of the day, there were so many objections to the line of questioning she would introduce when she finally got the opportunity to cross-examine Brandon Boudreaux. And, it is frustrating. And you could tell not just, the people sitting, on the tables there in front of the judge himself, but people sitting in the gallery are, kind of like, oh my goodness. Every time one of these statements comes up and she gets, has to be told, nope, that's not how this works. Or, especially the moment when she had to be taken out of the courtroom. So it's hard. And of course, the jury not in the courtroom for some of these moments, not during that conversation that we just heard either, but they did come in at some point today. And, I wonder, of course, we don't know, we can't speak to them yet. They're not supposed to be talking with the media, but that's the big question in all of this, is how is her demeanor really landing with the jurors? And, I hope one day we can get an answer to that question. But, when we talk about demeanor, Andrea, I think Lori's demeanor was really, it's worth examining her demeanor when she gets the opportunity to cross-examine Brandon Boudreaux. And of course, he was the state's first witness. They called him yesterday, and he walked through, this really difficult period in his life where he describes, on the brink of divorce with his wife, Melanie, who's Lori's niece. He says, that Lori was the one who was putting thoughts in Melanie's head that ultimately was one of the reasons why the marriage was dissolving. So that was a hard moment for him. And he also described about being shot at and just the different emotions that were going through his head during that time. And typically we see cross-examination after the state finishes its direct examination, but Daybell claimed that she didn't have some of these documents that she needed. Her investigator had them, who was not present, and she needed to wait for them. So we knew this cross-examination was coming out of order, but that it was coming today. And that's essentially what we saw. And we were able to see maybe some of those documents that she was referring to. She wasn't able to introduce any of them into evidence. But overall, Andrea, and we'll get into some of the more tense moments in just a bit, but overall, what did you make of her cross-examination of Brandon Boudreaux?
I thought it was, again, tense. Anytime, we've talked about how she kind of changes her demeanor when she's faced. We noticed that in the last trial. If she's talking to someone she knows or she has a history with, her demeanor seems to be a little bit different. Her approach is different. So I think that was obvious. I thought that Brandon Boudreaux sitting there on that witness stand was deliberate, very intentional about every word. He seemed to be, trying to focus, answering exactly what was asked and nothing more, which is usually coaching that witnesses get, advice that witnesses get. And so I thought he did a tremendous job, even when he had to ask multiple times, explain the question, ask the question again. I'm not sure what you're after. And so over time, I'm surprised that you don't see him sort of break down a little bit or kind of get flustered or, frustrated by it. I didn't see that much at all. I think that he did a tremendous job on the witness stand. I think that, I think he turned out to be, and I think proved to be a credible witness throughout all of it. I would expect that that's how most people would have viewed him if you're sitting there on that jury. But what's interesting is just to see how, again, to see her almost just drive a point to the extreme, in a sense that I honestly couldn't figure it out sometimes, what she was trying to get to. That
No,
to me
and
was confusing.
yeah, and I mean, as you said, Andrea, clearly Brandon was confused by some of the questioning, and I would imagine, jurors who are listening are wondering the same thing that you and I are wondering. And there were a lot of points where there were objections, so this wasn't clear questioning. There was a lot of points where they had to stop. The judge maybe had to explain things. It was a lot of objection sustained. And as you said, Andrea, this is someone she knew. He was married to her niece, Melanie, for about 10 years, is what I believe he said in his testimony. And, that's essentially how Vallow-Daybell started. And to go back to her last trial in Arizona for just a moment, we saw this when she cross-examined her own brother, Adam Cox. She kind of had this interesting demeanor of, well, we've known each other all this time. Kind of talking about their communication, their relationship, and trying to really, again, who knows, make some sort of point to the jury. But that's essentially how she started when she first got up to cross-examine Brandon Boudreaux. Take a listen.
And you were aware that I loved Melanie. Is that correct?
I can't say if you loved her or not.
But you saw that over the 10 years that you were married to her, right? You witnessed it with your own eyes.
What is it you're asking that I witnessed?
Me loving Melanie.
As I said, I can't state what you did or did not feel. I can't say what you felt.
But I acted in a way that was loving towards her, in as far as you knew.
I'm going to object again to relevance, 404 and 405 character evidence.
Sustain.
So we were all together as a family frequently, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And there were times when we were at your house as well as my house, is that correct?
An objection to relevance.
Sustained.
And until you sent me that text message on June 25th that we read yesterday, you and I had never had any disagreements with each other. Is that correct?
I would not agree with that statement.
You and I had ever had an argument?
Can you ask that question again?
Did you and I ever have an argument?
And again, as to foundation of when.
I'll allow him to answer. You can answer.
I'm sure we had, I don't know how you would define argument, but disagreements.
Face to face, you and I? Before the June 25th.
Hold on.
That's all I'm asking. Just before that.
Maybe rephrase it.
So by the time we met in 2008 until June 25th, 2019, did you and I ever have an argument?
Is there something you're looking for that you're trying to specify? And I'm not sure I can. That's a broad question that I can't think of a specific time where we argued face to face. If that's what you're looking for.
Correct. So you and I have never had an argument in our lifetimes.
I wouldn't agree with that. I would say that there have for sure been disagreements between us, but I can't think of a specific time that I could share where me and you face to face argued. I'm not a confrontational person.
Okay. You've known me for all these years. Am I a confrontational person?
I'm going to check the character evidence under 404 and 405.
Sustained.
That just that tone, sustained, here we go again. We've explained it and you're still doing it. Yeah. And listen to him. And he had that kind of Brandon Boudreaux had that same sort of, confusion may not be the right word, but just almost, I think
Just
he
like
wanted to ask so many times. Yeah. Like, what are you looking for? What do you want from me is kind of how it felt.
And Andrea, the only thing I can think of is she's trying to maybe establish to the jurors that possibly Brandon had some beef with her. We heard that a bit in her opening statement saying, well, maybe this was just a conspiracy against me. And obviously that's not what the state is saying. That's not what Brandon is saying. And on the stand, I think he, as you said, Andrea, he's just cool, calm, and collected, even though she's kind of like hitting sometimes the same point over and over, or asking the same question a different way. Sometimes when she's shut down, she just asks the question again. And it must be exhausting to be, on any end of this, but it was truly striking. And I think, I compartmentalize some of this, cross-examination into two parts, which is the part where she is trying to establish that she knows Brandon, she knows Melanie. And, at certain points she was saying, well, wasn't I there for the birth of your child? And he was like, no, you weren't there for the birth. But she's like, well, I came to visit with your family then. She's trying to show a side of her that is familial. And again, you just keep hearing those objections, and they're saying 404, 405. Those are those character, statements. That was the whole crux of the argument this morning. So it's interesting. But then I think the second part of, kind of the cross-examination is when she really goes back to the scene that day and, kind of tries to pick apart everything that he reported to police. So there was really this twofold. And I'm curious to think, just all of your thoughts on that, because there's so much to unpack here.
And, one of the things I can't help but think often when I'm listening to her is that she seems to contradict herself, even in her own kind of strategy. So, you were saying, like, she's bringing up, did we ever argue? But in a way that she's saying, we've never argued, right? We've been perfectly fine, while at the same time seeming to want to imply that he was out to get her, so that they've almost implying that they have a history of issue or history of disagreement. And yet at the same time, again, asking those questions to imply that we haven't had any issues, right? We're great. I like you. We've been fine together. We were family. And so I find there's a lot of contradiction in her own statements. And it reminds me of what she, kind of when she addressed the judge, I believe it was last week or a few weeks ago, when she was explaining, and she said to him, you've never, she said, you've never, ruled in my favor. And he said, but I have. And she's like, okay, well, only one time have you ruled in my favor. And it almost feels like that is the way she handles all of this, all of the testimony and the opening statements. It's almost like she tries one thing and then that doesn't work. She adjusts, even if it contradicts what she just said. And that to me is the most frustrating, difficult thing to watch as she tries to present this kind of confusing cross-examination.
Yeah. And, you heard in that interaction that we just played too, that not all the objections were sustained. He said, I'll allow this. So I think the judge isn't just saying no to you, lori-vallow. There's, he's being fair in the courtroom. And I think everyone can see that. And yeah, it's just hard when you hear her asking these same sorts of questions over and over again. And there was a point when, she kept talking about this argument that he had with his wife, Melanie, that again was seemingly the start of, their divorce proceedings. And Lori, according to the state, should be partly to blame for that. But she keeps kind of trying to bring certain tidbits in that she knows she absolutely cannot. And she has been told time and time again in sidebars, in open court, in other formats here, that she cannot be mentioning some of these things that she continues to mention. And we've said this before, Andrea, that you can't unring a bell. I don't think anything she said was particularly damaging to Brandon, but just the way she's trying to take, as try to take every possible road to get to the same point that she's trying to make, which isn't really a point at all. And it just,
Right.
I don't know. I don't think this works in her benefit. To your point, Andrea, it's confusing, to see what she's trying to do here.
Well, and even if she could make the point, I think that's the part that this seems contradictory or seems confusing, is that even if she could make the point, even if she were allowed to make the point, and a juror believed it, I believed it, a person, not me personally, but a person listening to it, I kind of find myself, then the next question is, so what? And often those questions, the stuff that she was trying to introduce today, so what if it were true? I'm not sure how she thinks that connects, or that helps her in trying to raise reasonable doubt about whether or not she had anything to do with this alleged shooting at Brandon Boudreaux. And so I can't connect those dots. And I wish I could understand her. I wish I could, wish I had a moment to just, break it down for me. Explain to me what you're trying to do, because I have a real hard time connecting those dots in the way that she's trying to do it. And I don't know if they connect for her or not. I can't begin to understand her.
I think that,
but
among many others, are the golden
tough.
question here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But it just seems contradictory.
It does. And, we mentioned earlier that she wanted to bring some documents for her questioning, and we saw some of that unfold today, where it seems that maybe she was going off of some pages from the police report, or maybe some sort of police filing that showed the interaction between Brandon Boudreaux and Detective Pillar, who was with the Gilbert Police Department. He's the case agent. We actually hear testimony from him later in the day. But she's almost, again, I think she's trying to lay out, unsuccessfully, if I may say, that, the officer and Brandon were in some way colluding against her. And that just, that's it, but the way he responded was just saying, like, no, that's, typical to how an investigation happens. He had to question me because I called 911 and reported a crime, and he came to talk to me about it. And, it was interesting because she was really trying to pick apart, what his mindset may have been like during those moments. And we talked a lot yesterday about how emotional it was for Brandon to, witness this, experience this, realize that, there's this Jeep, and he, a lot is going on at that moment, and he's calling 911. And she was really trying to, I would say, discredit him at every turn she possibly could. So take a listen to this.
Yeah.
So you conveyed to him that you were thinking it was just kids being kids, like a broken window?
I did not convey that to him, no.
So you did not say that on line 416?
I conveyed to him what I was thinking when I was talking to the dispatcher.
So why were you telling that to Detective Pillar if you did not believe that?
I just explained why.
Which was what?
I was explaining my thoughts when I was talking to the dispatcher.
So he wasn't asking you a direct question. You were just going over what you said to the 911 dispatcher?
I was explaining in that context that you're referring to what I was thinking when I was talking to the dispatcher, when I said that I thought it might be a paintball gun.
But you had said before you were confused because you didn't even really know what was going on at that moment. Is that correct?
I would not say that's correct.
So you did not convey that maybe somebody really didn't shoot over here?
As I said, I was explaining to him in that context about why I had said to the dispatcher that I thought it might be a paintball gun.
But you didn't believe it was a paintball gun at that time?
Which time are you referring, when I'm talking to Detective Pillar or when I made the 911 call?
Both.
When I made the 911 call, I thought someone was shooting at me. But as I explained, I had the thought nothing had come through my window, so perhaps it was a paintball gun, which I shared with the 911 operator. And when I talked to Detective Pillar, I was certain that someone had shot at me. I could see the bullet hole in my car, and as soon as I saw that, I knew for certain that all of the other things made more sense, and that was exactly what happened.
Okay.
So that, I mean, she goes on and on about what color he thought the Jeep was. And I mean, we had to hear about puke green and was it gray? I mean, on and on. And even drawing, attention to the fact that he had the VIN numbers for the Jeep that, she did own. And so he would have known. And I think trying to imply that he used the information that he had about that Jeep to then explain that or give that to police, to kind of try to tie her to it. But I think that was lost. I don't think she ever came in full circle or really made that point. And instead he just kept repeating the same thing, is that, yes.
Yeah, which oftentimes was, no, that's not correct. And it's interesting because the way she asks her questions is essentially either taking maybe a statement she thinks happened or something that someone said in testimony, and she'll just say it over and correct. And I, could sense from the jury as we got on, throughout the day with her cross-examination here that they were getting a little fidgety. And I'm wondering if they were just like, okay, we've heard this before. She's just kind of asking, did this happen? Did this happen? Did this happen? And if he didn't agree with it, he would say no. And you could tell she would kind of say, well, did you say this? And she kind of would ask it a few more times until it, like you said, Andrea, didn't really land, especially with some of that Jeep stuff. And speaking of the Jeep, she, it's believed by investigators in the state that it was Alex Cox who was in the Jeep who shot at Brandon Boudreaux back in October 2019. And, there's some distinct things about this Jeep that come up later too, that it didn't have a back tire on it. This is a Jeep Wrangler. That's, kind of the signature to have that tire on the back. But she had asked him, because they are family, or, married, through marriage, they were related, in a sense. Sure. She said, well, do you know who my brother is, Alex Cox? He said, yes. She's like, well, do you know what he looks like? And, he confirms that he did. And she said, well, but you didn't see who was driving the Jeep. And he said, no, I didn't. And I think she was, trying to connect the dots that he would have noticed if it was her brother, but he's like, I just didn't see the driver. I'm not saying that it wasn't your brother. In fact, I'm saying that I think it was because, it's only you two that I told police who could possibly be after me. And it's really interesting, again, to see her. I feel like the way it comes off in the courtroom is that she is just grilling this poor guy who has been through so much. And I don't think it's landing.
No. And asking the same questions, as said, over and over and over, and not even a different way, but really just continuing. And I think that over time, that does seem a lot like badgering, or does seem, feels exhausting, feels grating. And if it doesn't ever get to a point, she isn't ever really able to make some sort of, there is no aha. I think that over time I think jurors will struggle with that. I don't see how that works well in her favor. At all. Haven't seen it. I just haven't seen it, and I don't see it coming together. And so it's interesting, though, she took a long time to talk to him, right? I mean, this cross-examination lasted for a while.
Several hours.
Yeah. And then what did we really get out of it? That's the question.
That's a great question. I guess maybe the more important question is, what did the jury get out of it? Because that's, that's what they are taking in here to eventually make a decision on this case. And there's a person that we've been talking about, Andrea, Melanie. This is Lori's niece, Brandon's ex-wife. They, their marriage unraveled as this all kind of unfolded here back in, June, July, August into October 2019. But we actually got some really interesting intel about her in the courtroom today. And as far as we knew it was believed that she's been involved with this group, that she's Lori's niece. It was, almost like Lori was almost like a mother figure to her because her own mother died when she was young. And Alex Cox was her uncle. So these were her family members, and she was very close with them. And what we haven't heard a lot about in this case are the dark religious beliefs that are at the core of some of her prior convictions, including thinking that her own children were zombies and that they needed to die, and that she was trying to essentially get rid of people so she could be with Chad Daybell and take people's money, and just this horrible, horrible set of crimes here. And the state has been very deliberate not to bring any of that in because it could, again, jeopardize the trial, or maybe a door opens and they can at this rate. But her name does come up a lot, more so in this trial than we ever have before, just because she was married to Brandon Boudreaux. And, it's interesting because it almost feels like Lori and she says later on, I'm not trying to blame Melanie, but
Right.
it feels like she's trying to kind of throw her under the bus here.
Well, that was certainly a point of contention. I mean, that was certainly something that came up directly. And, the prosecution asking, I mean, they obviously felt that same way and said, if this is what we're doing, if you're going to try to say that a third party was responsible, tell us that now, because, we have a right to present our case with that defense in mind. And so, and that's something, that's when she said, no, I'm not trying to blame her, but yet through her questioning was bringing her up, right? Was talking about her motive, and she was trying to enter evidence that would potentially point to Melanie having some financial gain. And again, the prosecutor and the judge later warning, if you do that, we're Brandon knows the history. He knows about Charles Vallow. He understands, that idea that was for financial gain and personal gain. And so, if you're going to go down that path and you're going to draw that in, be careful. Be careful,
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
you may not like what else comes with it.
Absolutely. And as you said, Andrea, this kind of comes to a head in a moment where Lori is trying to introduce her own evidence in cross-examination, which is pretty unusual, I would say, to begin with. And, we'll get into whether the judge allows that in just a bit. But I want to take people inside the courtroom for this moment, because as I said, we learned some really big information about Melanie Boudreaux, now Melanie Pulowski, but again, Lori's niece. Take a listen.
So what's relevant about it?
A lot of things, Your Honor.
What?
Judge, I can't hear her.
Please speak into the mic.
It's relevant to his discussion with Detective Pillar from the October 2nd date until this date on February 12th.
What is relevant about it that is an issue for this jury to decide? That's what relevance means. It's something that this jury would either make something more or less probable for some fact that they need to decide.
It's relevant in the way that this email communicates that the information that was being given to the detectives was directly from Brandon Boudreaux.
I know, but what in the content of that email is relevant for this case?
The fact that the last line.
Did I miss something? What's the last line?
That's why not. I had to see it as well.
At the bottom? That's okay. Hold on. Make sure everyone can hear you and the court reporter can.
I would have to ask to see that as well. I don't.
So the last line was Detective Pillar writes, is it Pillar or Pillar?
Pillar, like a pillar in a building.
Pillar. Detective Pillar writes, this information is requested so we can see if Melanie has any financial gain from your death, basically, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so that creates motive for Melanie. It seems like I guess it's fair area for him to talk about in general, but it's also a fair area for you to talk to the detective about what areas they investigated. But let me hear the state's response. But as far as that particular email comes in, I mean, I suppose you could ask some questions about it, but let me hear from the state.
Judge, obviously that's a conglomeration of emails, so I don't know that fully covers everything too. I guess the defendant has never raised a third-party defense. I'm not sure if she's trying to say that this was all Melanie Boudreaux, but that is actually an open investigation that is still ongoing. The state has, obviously in trial, referred to her as an active member of this conspiracy. So I'm not sure if she's trying to admit that or just question him if he was providing information to the police. But the last thing I will, again, just in terms of opening the door, is she's made a big deal about the number of calls and text messages. And as I've indicated, there is still an open investigation against Melanie Boudreaux. And so many of that information might relate to that case, or it might also relate to the Tammy Daybell case, because there was information about that, as well as the Charles Vallow case. So to infer that all of those conversations related solely to this defendant, this incident, October 2nd, is probably a little disingenuous.
Were you intending to enter that as an exhibit, or just were you asked to provide information that Melanie might have a motive?
I would like to admit it, and I would like to question him on it as well, yes.
What is the bait page on
It's
that?
Bates 5465.
I don't know that there's anything in it that's particularly misleading or anything like that to the jury. I don't know how relevant it is, but I think to the extent that there may have been some questions about Melanie's participation and whether or not she had a motive are relevant. What's the state's response, I guess? I know she didn't notice third-party defense.
I guess I'm asking now, is she doing that? Obviously, I have a right to know before the trial ends if that's an active defense she's asking for.
I am not, Your Honor. I'm trying to say the connection that I've been accused of with Melanie connects me to Melanie. So that's why I'm trying to establish, how am I connected to this? I didn't have a financial gain here. This is the financial gain through Melanie. This is conversations between the detective and Brandon that I want to question him on. I'm not trying to blame Melanie. It's my point.
I have not alleged a financial gain for the defendant, so
What was that? I'm sorry.
said I have not alleged a financial gain. I've not alleged much of a motive because we are trying to keep out much of that. So I guess, again, if we're going to start going into motives, then we have prior instance of the defendant having financial gain in the previous trial that we did here. So if we want to go into the whole overarching financial scheme and cult activities, then we can do that. But again, the state had decided not to bring in any of that.
Now remember, this is all happening without the jury in the room. But those are some strong words. The cult activity, if, warning her that if we're going to go down this path, okay. This is a good example also of where I don't understand the argument. I do not understand what Lori is trying to connect to, because it's as if she's trying to draw connection to her and Melanie while then at the same time saying, but we're different. So maybe she did it, but I didn't have anything to do with it.
Defense. Yeah.
Right.
No,
yeah.
and it sounds like she's actively not trying to do that.
Right.
But so again, it is confusing as to what she's trying to do. And I think the good point there to say, well, if you do want to go down that route, we can change our case right on up, because we have this other evidence against you. And we talked about this yesterday. We noticed that Trina K did not bring in much of a motive. And again, she confirmed today that's intentional. But that big information about Melanie, and of course she was basically the topic of discussion there, was that there is an open investigation into her. We did not have that information confirmed before. We knew that she was involved in this, of course, but we did not know that the case was still open. I actually reached out to the Gilbert Police Department here locally about this, and they told me they could not give me information about that due to a court order. So this was some pretty big information that was confirmed there. And it goes back to the question we've brought up here many times, Andrea. Will Melanie Boudreaux, or Melanie Pulowski, as her name is now, she's been remarried, will she ever get charged? And it sounds like maybe there could be something coming up the pipeline, or at least that this investigation is not over. But to be clear, she has not been charged at this point in time.
Right. And it could be, that could be the language that she's using, simply to say that, because there is not any definitive answer and that information is still out there and it's not being introduced into evidence, that would be technically considered an open case. Of course, we can't be sure if that means that investigators are actively working the case, or if they are, if there's information with the prosecutor's office where they're making charging decisions. We don't know that piece. However, obviously the prosecutor herself, they're saying, that we don't have, by no means has anyone said she won't be charged or that she couldn't be charged. And so they are not comfortable, bringing her name, at least in that way, that they have called her potentially a co-conspirator, right? We've heard that. but saying that, if we're going to go down that path and Lori's going to point to her and saying she is the one who did it instead of me, then that's going to be a much different case. But interestingly, that the prosecutor did not shy away from that. She just said, let me know, and we would be happy to, because then that is when we would see all of the other motive information come in, which we would almost undoubtedly see the Charles Vallow information come in and things like that. And so, I think that would be a very, very difficult mountain to climb if Lori had to, manage all of that in court as well in this trial.
Absolutely. And that's not something that's actively happening. It sounds like, again, when they're telling Lori to heal, it seems like she always, does it at the last second. But it is striking. And to go back to that, document she was trying to admit, in the courtroom, it sounded like, again, we could hear them discussing this again outside the presence of the jury, sounded like 3, maybe copy and pasted emails butted against each other between the detective Ryan Pillar with the Gilbert Police Department and Brandon Boudreaux. So they're saying, we don't even know, which investigation he might be referring to when he's asking about that. And, ultimately the judge says, you don't need to admit it. It's, there's more information on that we don't need to be asking about. But he does say, once they come back from their lunch break, he does say, you can ask Brandon Boudreaux whether he was asked to provide any documentation that would show Melanie would have a financial gain. So Lori does that. But he also tells the state that you can ask Brandon Boudreaux on redirect whether you did this, and you can follow up on that. And you can also ask him whether he had spoken about a different case. Maybe some of this could be related to something else. So that it opened the door just a little crack. And the judge said, depending on the rest of Daybell's cross-examination, maybe it could open a little more. It didn't, as we go through the rest of the afternoon, it didn't really go in that direction. But it was interesting, Andrea, because, as we see this go out, and we'll get to Brandon's, once the state comes back up and can talk to him on redirect in just a minute. But I'm surprised, I might be jumping ahead a little bit here, but after he was done, the jury didn't have any questions, which I wonder if they were maybe just exhausted by all of the cross-examination and how many hours it took. But when they ask about a different case or something like that, it's interesting because I feel like, not to compare her juries, but I feel like the last jury she had she was on trial for conspiring to kill her husband, Charles Vallow. They seem to be really, really attentive. And I'm not saying that this jury isn't, that many of them are taking notes, but again, a lot of them were fidgeting today. It was just a really long day in court. But I just wanted to share my remarks on that, but maybe bring it back now to, the cross-examination wrapping up finally. And then we hear again from the state, who's able to talk to Brandon and talk him through, some of the points that Lori was trying to make in court. So what did you think of that?
And trying to discredit him. I think that then it was the state's opportunity to come back and essentially just reaffirm. Really, what it boiled down to was reaffirming: did what you see, is it true? Is that what you saw? Did it come simply from the day that you experienced it, not from any other information or not from any other, trying to plant information or trying to, share information that wasn't about that day, but that came from a VIN record, as Lori seemed to kind of sort of hint at. And I think that was, just her opportunity to come back and just reaffirm, is this what happened? Yes. You remember it clearly? Yes. Right. I mean, that's really what she did, is to try to, this is their opportunity essentially to clean up, after what has been talked about over those last few hours during that cross-examination. This is her way to kind of succinctly bring it back to what she's hoping the jury hears and understands from that testimony, that from her, what she presented yesterday when she questioned Brandon herself, the Trina K. So, and I think he did exactly that. He answered that exactly how she would expect him to.
And I mentioned that, Lori's cross-examination of Brandon kind of fell into two camps. It was kind of like the family dynamics of it all, and then the day of the crime. And as you said, Andrea, Trina K was able to circle back on all of that. And we want to play just some portions of that for you now. So take a listen.
I'm going to start by talking to you about June 25th, okay? Why did that date stick in your mind?
It was a painful date.
You can get closer to you, Mike.
It was a painful date.
Why was it a painful day? Why did that stick in your mind?
My grandfather was someone who was really important to me, and I was dealing with I mean, sudden loss is traumatic. So I was dealing with that, and my family is the most important thing in this world to me, and so the dissolving of my family was probably one of the most painful things that I've gone through as a person, and that date is the start of the dissolving of my family.
Okay. So when you were talking with Melanie, was the focus of that argument about your marriage?
Because
And during that argument, did you and Melanie discuss issues within your marriage?
yes,
And during that, did Melanie bring up reasons why the marriage was over?
yes,
Did any of those reasons involve things that Melanie claimed you did to her aunt, lori-vallow?
yes,
So one of the reasons why the marriage was going to end was because of this defendant, lori-vallow, things that she said you had done to her.
yes,
Did that include the idea that you had hacked into lori-vallow's computer?
yes,
So that's something that Melanie was bringing up to you during this argument about the end of your marriage.
yes,
Did the issue of you helping Charles Vallow try to take away Lori's Temple recommend also come up?
yes.
So why did you call 911?
Because I believe in following the law.
Did you think that you'd been shot?
Yes, and I wanted protection. I wanted to feel safe.
Okay. When you saw that bullet hole in your car and no paint on your car, what went through your head?
I think, like I said, it's a really scary thought because up until then, I think you want to feel safe. And so I was trying, my window was broken, but I didn't see a bullet hole. And I was trying to think of something to make myself feel maybe safer. And when I saw that, I knew that there was no other option than that someone just shot at me and they were meaning to kill me. There's no other logical explanation for why that would have happened.
So after hours of Lori questioning and asking all these things in a matter of seconds, minutes, Trina K, I think, really dialed in to exactly what was all that she wanted Brandon Boudreaux to explain. And I think
Absolutely.
it essentially took away everything that we just heard from Lori. I don't think those questions were relevant anymore at all when you put it so succinctly. And he did a great job right there of explaining exactly what he was thinking, exactly what he was feeling, and why. And I think, and also pointing again, Lori tried to kind of explain her connection and yet didn't do that very well, I don't think. And then here, I think that's really the first time we understand, I think, very clearly. So she was kind of the motivator here, in this, what he described as very shocking, surprising, had no idea that his marriage was potentially going to end. I think he just, talked about that a couple of times, is that this really did feel like it kind of came out of the blue. And so then she was able to tie how Lori factored into that.
Absolutely. And, it's interesting because we see this, in court, and we've seen it from Trina K was the prosecutor in her last Arizona trial as well. And, you can only do so much when you're on direct examination. I feel like sometimes it's almost easier to put a bow on everything or really drive your point in a way when you have the opportunity to come back on redirect. And I think she really took advantage of that today. And eventually Brandon Boudreaux was let off the stand. I'll say before, he has a lot of people in the courtroom with him. His current wife is in there. Kay Woodcock was also there today. She's J.J. Vallow's grandmother, Charles Vallow's sister, someone who, if you've been following along with the cases from Idaho to Arizona, you know how big of a figure she is in all of this. And, it seemed like he had some other family members and other supporters that were in the courtroom with him. And, at one point when they were leaving the courtroom, in between one of the breaks, they were just giving him a hug. I think it was a really tough day for Brandon, and I think he really held his own on the stand there, both during the cross-examination and really bringing it back in an impactful way on the redirect. But he wasn't the only witness that took the stand. Earlier in the day, we heard from someone in the neighborhood who had Ring camera video, and you could hear it was unclear to me, they said you could see a vehicle in it. That was not as
Right.
obvious, I think, in the footage, but what you can hear is a bang. And I think they
Yeah.
were saying this, it was neighbors were asked, do you have anything on camera during this time frame that could be a car fleeing or sound like any sort of gunfire? So they brought that neighbor in to testify. And then we heard some from some investigators later this afternoon on the stand, some familiar, including Detective Nathan Duncan, who was the case agent on the Chandler investigation, which has come up several times in this trial, Andrea. But it's interesting because the state is very, very careful to just keep calling it the July 2019 incident that involves Lori and Alex Cox. And they haven't gone further from that. And when they called him, I was like, okay, maybe we're getting more out of him here. But no, his testimony was very, very narrow as well as to the Jeep that he saw when they were at the crime scene on that day. This, again, being Charles Vallow's death investigation. The jury does not know that. And I did notice, though, Andrea, that some of the images they were showing, essentially what they're trying to do is say, this was the Jeep. It had Texas plates. That's what Brandon said he saw. We can link this Jeep to Lori-Vallow and her family. And it was interesting because some of the photos actually had crime scene tape on it. So, again, I wonder if the jury is, digesting that or taking it in as they, see some of that stuff when they aren't being given all the information about that incident.
Sure. And at some point they're going to, surely they've caught on now that, the incident, they're purposefully, intentionally not giving more information. Of course, as we know, the legal grounds for that very, very clear. They can't bring that information in, given all the rules around evidence and how you can bring the defendant's past into a trial. When you can do that, lots of rules about that, and those are those forms and those motions that they keep talking about and referencing, both with character but also her past criminal history. We won't hear any of that until the adjudication phase or until that, until when we get into the sentencing and all of that. That's when all of that will come up. But I think that surely they have caught on by now that there's something there that they're not allowed to know. Which, of course,
well, even just
human
us
nature
being
is to
in
wonder
there and
what.
all the attention on the case.
Yeah.
Just media being in the room. I think you have to know right off the jump that this isn't your standard case here. And, we heard from Detective Duncan. We also heard from someone with DPS, that's the Department of Public Safety here in Arizona, who testified about, being able to take the infotainment system out of Alex Cox's truck. That's some evidence in this case as well. And then finally, to conclude the day, we heard from the case agent on this Gilbert case here, Detective Ryan Pillar. So he took the stand and kind of walked through some of the more technical stuff here about responding to the scene, how they were looking for the casings, just responding to that Tesla, that sort of dynamic. And his testimony will continue into next week is what we are expecting. So what did you make of all of that before we close up here tonight?
This is where we're going to get into those technical, more tedious they have to lay all that foundation about how they were able to gather this evidence and, the cell phone data, the way that works, how information is pulled, what they can tell from a cell phone, what they can't tell, the difference between knowing that a call was made between two numbers, not having information about what was said or what was shared on an open phone line, things like that. I think, a lot of that technical information is necessary, but not quite as sexy as a lot of the other stuff that we have seen. But yet, of course, we know that's an important part of laying that foundational evidence. And so I expect we'll see a lot more of that, as we start next week. But certainly those are all big parts of connecting all of the dots in this case, and will surely help draw it all together as the prosecution plans to lay it all out.
Yeah. And as I said, he's the case agent. So we're expecting him to maybe he's the, expert on this case, so to speak. So he'll continue with his testimony. This is direct examination of the detective from Trina Kay. And then, of course, Daybell will have the opportunity to cross-examine him if she takes that opportunity. And we're also expecting next week, Andrea, we're going to be resuming court on Monday, but we're expecting at least one Idaho investigator to come out. We're expecting some people to come in from out of town. So these are some of the witnesses that the prosecutor had to reschedule, but we are going to hear them on the stand at some point. So that's what's coming up down the pipeline for next week.
Sounds great. And of course, we will be there to take you inside the courtroom, and we hope you'll join us for all of that next week. We'll see you then.